Hello and welcome. You're listening to Set B Productions. My name is Rana. In our last video, we looked at 11 metrics to help determine just how good a place was to live. If you haven't seen it yet, the link is in the description. Today, we're going to apply those metrics to gorgeous New Zealand. Let's dive in. New Zealand. Home to stunning scenery, tons of sheep, and some of the best special effects anywhere, this island nation faces challenges just like everywhere else. Yet the people have a reputation for a laid-back and welcoming disposition, both friendly and warm. It's a peaceful democratic nation with a bright future, and it just might be one of the most ideal places to live on the planet. General culture and attitude. The general culture of New Zealand is, again, considered fairly laid back, uninterested in pretentiousness, and welcoming to outsiders. As a rule, they care deeply about the environment and the natural beauty surrounding them. Meats are going to make up a larger part of the diet here than in many countries, with fresh produce commanding quite a high price, but vegetarian and vegan lifestyles do appear to be well represented and respected. You're going to pay a little bit more on average for most things, due to most of them needing to be imported from around the globe. But rent for housing is a bit cheaper than the US, again on average, and it's very comparable overall. There's a unique blend of Maori tradition that's woven through the Western-style culture that's quite beautiful, but I can't pretend that it hasn't come at a cost to the Maori people, or that no tensions remain. I'll delve into that a little further in the internal pressures section below. If you've made your home in a Western nation before, you're going to fit right in New Zealand and have a great time doing it. On the upside, it's a slower, quieter, more outdoors and nature-focused life than you may get in many urban areas of, for instance, the US, but that can be just as much of a downside depending on your specific desires. Don't go to New Zealand expecting New York City. About half the population lives in the busier urban areas like Auckland, Christchurch, or Wellington, with the rest of the population fairly evenly spread between the less urban and more rural areas that make up the rest of the islands. Geography and climate change. The geography is just something else. Somehow, a few decently sized islands have just about every biome you could ask for, generally within a short drive or even a short hike, and there's a darn good reason that such epics as Lord of the Rings were filmed here. In short, if you want it, you can probably find it here. I truly cannot say enough about New Zealand's natural beauty, and I have mostly good news about its future. With about 2/3 of the population living within 3 miles or 5 kilometers of the coast, the impacts of climate change are going to be felt by much of the nation in a very real sense. With that being said, it honestly doesn't look too terribly bad here, especially compared to some areas I've looked into. Sea level rise is going to force some moves, invasive species and tropical diseases are going to become increasingly common, snowpacks are growing less and less each year, flooding is becoming more of an issue, and we can expect a lot of these general trends to continue over the coming years. None of it looks too extreme or unmanageable from my perspective and the forecasts I'm seeing, though it'll certainly involve plenty of disruption, and any change can feel dire in the moment. All told, it looks like the biggest concern for an outdoors-oriented Kiwi is still more likely to be skin cancer due to greater UV exposure rather than any specific weather event. New Zealand is a net energy importer in the form of petroleum products, but when it comes to electricity, about 80% is produced via renewable means, and studies have shown that they could produce up to 100% of their needs without cutting any consumption, purely through renewables. This makes New Zealand a world leader in renewable energy, but there's a lot of energy used that isn't just electricity, and renewables only make up about 40% of the grand total. All told, New Zealand meets a majority of its own needs and is working quite hard to become a net exporter by both building out more refineries and by focusing on building more renewable solutions. Most of its oil imports come in from the Middle East, but Asia remains a crucial trading partner there as well. With a population of a touch over 5 million, New Zealand produces enough food for 40 million people, so any matters of food and water insecurity, which the impoverished can struggle with, are purely a matter of social issues, not practical issues. The land will absolutely support the population. Legal matters. Moving on to legal matters, New Zealand incarcerates between 149 and 164 out of 100,000 people depending on the source, putting it firmly in the middle of the pack in terms of how many people are locked up per capita. What this means in terms of peers is that New Zealand imprisons roughly double the number of people per capita that many of their European counterparts would, but is roughly on par with nations like Australia and a little more aggressive than the UK. The US is of course an outlier here with about 629 per 100,000 in prison, and comparatively, New Zealand looks exceptionally free indeed. Now, this doesn't mean they're satisfied and leaving it alone. Instead, they're making some really dramatic and positive moves in terms of prison reform, and have already reduced their overall prison population by 8%, with an intention of lowering it quite a bit further. People at all levels appear to honestly and earnestly wish to improve matters, and they're making great strides to do so, starting with the low-hanging fruit, the relatively easy stuff that hasn't even required legislative changes, just some social and cultural shifts that have somehow actually materialized. Coming from the US, I just have to say that successful prison reform is kind of blowing my mind. But let's say you've been arrested and are caught up in the legal system. What sort of protections are there for you? First of all, you're presumed innocent until found guilty, so there's that. And second of all, you have the right to freely and privately talk with your lawyer. And if you don't have one, you'll be provided a list of lawyers for you to contact and begin your relationship with. If it proceeds that far, every New Zealander has the right to a fair trial. Most charges in New Zealand do result in convictions, about 73%, but let's break that down a little bit. First of all, the number of adults being charged with a crime is falling and has been since 2009. 2020 and 2021 are minor outliers with this pandemic depressing rates of everything, but they honestly don't look much out of line with where the trend was heading anyway. The most common charges filed were for traffic violations and for offenses against justice, such as breaching your sentence of community service, with much smaller categories following that up for theft and assault and drug usage or possession. Speaking of which, it's important to note that while it's gaining legality in many areas around the world, marijuana is currently illegal in New Zealand. The future. New Zealand faces a host of internal and external pressures that are going to shape the coming decades. I cannot say at all how any of these will turn out, only that they're the biggest and most obvious issues facing New Zealanders today. First, internal pressures. As I promised above, I will cover the Maori Relations a little here. This is worth a great deal more than a small mention in this video could do justice to, so I would encourage anyone interested to dig into this more outside of here. I'll link some resources in the description to help you get started, but one statistic jumped out to me that sort of told a lot of the story in itself. More than half of their prison population is made up of Maori people, while the Maori people only make up 15% of the total population of New Zealand. I don't have a single good explanation for this, but I do have good news. That prison reform I mentioned above is necessarily going to have an outsized and positive impact on the Maori community. The Maori have a unique history of colonization, and their relationship with the Europeans is unlike any I've seen anywhere else, though with a few common threads that will sound familiar to anyone that has taken any history class anywhere. The short version is, the Maori signed the Treaty of Waitangi in 1840 to preserve their rule of their lands, and by 1845 the New Zealand Wars had broken out because they didn't feel that was going very well. But really they got going strong in the 1860s as the Maori lost most of their territories. At this point, it was just kind of widely assumed that their way of life would go extinct and that they would assimilate into the Western European lifestyle instead, and eventually laws were enacted to not so gently encourage that conversion, but that's not the entire story. In 1867, the Maori gained 4 parliamentary seats, and as a result, Maori men gained the right to vote a solid 12 years before that right was extended to all European men. Women would have to wait another 26 years until 1893, but at that point it was extended to all women, not just Maori, European, or any other group. The first half of the 20th century saw a great deal of revival that continues to this day in terms of lifestyle, traditions, culture, and language. At this point, the Maori people are a well-respected and indispensable part of New Zealand's fabric, from the haka to cultural exports as far-ranging as bionicles. As with everywhere else on planet Earth, New Zealand is facing off against COVID-19, but they've got the rather massive benefit of being a bunch of islands. Their vaccination rate is over 90%, and if you wish to look to a Western nation for an example of doing it right, you could do far worse than New Zealand, with a grand total of 25 deaths so far. While tragic, that's phenomenal compared to literally everyone else. They're facing an increasing and compounding set of issues where inflation and the cost of living continue to increase, housing availability, particularly in urban areas, continues to decrease, and the economy in general has hit a few speed bumps in a row, as the global economy has as well, since they're so incredibly linked due to imports and exports making up so much of their general economic churn. That leads us to external pressures. New Zealand is about as dependent on the rest of the world as it wants to be at any point in time. As I said above, it produces more than enough food, it's working on producing enough energy, it's not far from being able to tell the rest of the planet to go take a hike if it feels like it after a rough Monday. They aren't a superpower, and they don't pretend otherwise, but have maintained a web of alliances and trading partners that makes pretty much everyone happy to be New Zealand's friend. Sort of the Southern Hemisphere's Canada. They walk a bit of a tightrope between East and West spheres of influence, trying to keep both the US and China happy, but often keeping both merely content to grumble instead. China in particular is not afraid to flex its muscle and dabble in espionage and political or electoral interference. As tensions rise and the relatively new AUKUS alliance rises in the Pacific, New Zealand is noticeably absent. This could be purely due to their ban on all things nuclear, as some have claimed, but regardless, New Zealand is left dealing with and reacting to situations after others have made decisions, not been in the room when the decisions were made or been the decision makers themselves, which is a tough position to be in. How easy will it be to move there and make a life? So, let's say this all sounds reasonable. They're not facing anything that other nations aren't facing, the people are very welcoming, the landscape is breathtaking, and you've decided to take the plunge. What are you in for? Well, if you're under 30, you can get a 12-month preview with a working holiday visa. That'll let you get a job and generally live your life there to see if it's the place for you. If you're not under 30, you'd better hope you're under 55. They don't seem to be much interested in being a retirement destination, at least unless you've got some serious money, in which case it's a very different story. Funny how that works. If you're between 30 and 55, there are several work-to-residence visa options depending on how in demand your particular skill set is, or how much you're willing to invest and start your own business there. Or you pretty much need to have a job offer ready to go for a skilled migrant visa. Any of these options will let you live and work there, and after 5 years of life you can apply for citizenship, unless you've been caught for something naughty, in which case, not so much. Healthcare. Healthcare in New Zealand is offered on a subsidized basis, but as is common in many places, private insurance also exists to cover electives and to skip waiting lines, which can stretch out to the better part of a year for some surgeries. Like the US, dental care is not considered to be part of overall healthcare after you turn 18, so you'll need separate insurance or care for that, and many simply go without. Ouch. All in all, while a bit messy, the system seems to function quite well and truly provides for the needs of the population, though there will always be those that are unhappy with any system. Education. Education in New Zealand is world-class, with primary and secondary education being required through age 16 for everyone at no cost, and 8 internationally recognized universities awaiting those who wish to take their education further. COVID interrupted their traditional in-class activities, and they've been adapting to a hybrid system since then that they're still working the kinks out of, but hey, who isn't? About 12% of kids are leaving high school without graduating, but that rate varies pretty wildly depending on the school and the region that it's in, and many factors can go into a person's decision to leave school early, so it's difficult to point to any one factor or explanation. Regardless, young boys and the Maori are the most affected, and the Education Ministry is greatly concerned and is working to remedy this. Despite this rather fantastic system, New Zealand has one of the lowest rates of higher education program completion among OECD countries, at least when you look purely at bachelor's degrees and higher. But that's not telling the whole story, because they're certainly getting and using their education. In a study published by the New Zealand government and linked below, it appears that the New Zealanders were getting their tertiary education in their desired subjects, they simply weren't quite finishing out the qualifications needed to actually get their degree, at least not at quite the rates that other OECD countries were. This was due to an overabundance of part-time and returning students that were perhaps there for a specific area of study more than getting a general degree. To me, this falls right in line with the people that largely care a lot about the capability to do something, and a little less about the title that may accompany it. Social safety net. New Zealand absolutely has a social safety net, which has been thoroughly tested in the wake of the pandemic and the economic turmoil it unleashed. Everyone seems to agree on that much. Where the disagreement comes in is if that welfare system does enough to keep people's heads above water, and whether or not it's kept pace with the changing realities around it. but that disagreement is going to exist in literally every nation on the planet. The unemployment system is the primary focus here, and is handled by WINZ, Work and Income New Zealand. It's designed to keep a little money rolling in while you're between jobs, and has similar requirements to the US, that you look for work, that you accept a reasonable job if it's offered, that sort of thing. But there are so many different forms of welfare that the New Zealand government literally has an A to Z page set up on a website just listing all the different kinds of benefits they offer. I'll hit a few main ones here, but I want to draw special attention to New Zealand being the first in the world to offer pensions for the elderly, starting all the way back in 1898. Paid parental leave is 26 weeks as of July 2020 and has been slowly creeping up to reach that point since 2002. The primary support systems in place appear to be support for single parents, support for youth, support for young parents, disability support, and housing support for those that need it. The last major form of welfare is what we would call Social Security in the US, but what they call superannuation. It kicks in once a citizen or permanent resident is age 65 or older and has met a few other requirements, like living there long enough. All in all, from what I can tell, New Zealand has a fairly thorough and definitely well-meaning social safety net, more designed to help people that have fallen on hard times than to punish them. Good job. Transportation. Unless you plan to live exclusively in an urban area, plan on owning a car, or getting very familiar with someone that does. You're probably going to need it. Kiwis don't seem to have anything against mass transit, and actually have a decent busing system for land travel and ferries between the islands, but again, you're probably going to want a car for most trips. Auckland and Wellington have been building out their commuter rail systems, which are always great to see, but the percentage of people actually using mass transit systems for their commutes remains in the low single digits. It's simply not a reality at this point in time. Get a car and expect to pay for gas. At the time of writing, a gallon of gas costs the equivalent of $7.91 US. General freedom. When it comes to general freedom, New Zealand is about as free as it comes. Freedom House ranks them as 99 out of 100 in their global freedom score, while for comparison the US gets a score of 83. What does this actually mean? Well, this means that this is a well-established, free, and open democracy that's functioning as it ought to be, and that, practically speaking, you can largely do what you wish to do, when you wish to do it, how you wish to do it, within reason, and it's hard to ask for more than that. For a couple of concrete examples, abortions are available on demand, gun ownership is legal and common, though with some restrictions in place, freedom of and from religion is observed and codified, and freedom of movement and association is greatly respected. Freedom of speech, freedom of the press, and rule of law in general are all foundational parts of society here that help to create a safe, welcoming, and extremely free nation. So, what is it that makes New Zealand special? And that's really all I have to say about that. All in all, New Zealand has a fantastic environment, welcoming people with an incredible culture, a stable and extremely functional government, some major hurdles to face just like every other nation, and a very bright future ahead indeed. For now and the foreseeable future, this makes New Zealand one of the most ideal places to live on the planet. So, what do you think? Would you make your home in New Zealand? What did we miss, and where should we cover next? Let us know in the comments below, and thank you for watching.